Close your eyes and visualize this moment. You are standing in the belly of the beast, a lavish marble chamber, where the air is heavy with steam and the suffocating scent of expensive imported perfumes. You are standing so close to the precipice of death that you can actually hear the rhythmic breathing of the most dangerous predator walking the earth. For 10 long years, you have been the one to fill his golden chalice with wine. You have mirrored his smiles to stay alive. And you have mastered the art of keeping your face distinctively blank, while he casually waves a hand to extinguish a human life. The man in the water is Commodus, the Caesar, the absolute ruler of Rome. And right at this second, separated from you by nothing but a thin curtain of vapor, he is soaking in his private sanctuary, totally relaxed and completely oblivious to the storm that is about to break. Because mere minutes ago, you stumbled upon a secret that was never meant for your eyes, a secret that changes everything. It was just a small, unassuming tablet hidden beneath a stack of official correspondence, but the handwriting was neat, precise, and terrified you to your core. It is a hit list, a ledger of doom. Names carved into the wax, and next to each one, a specific, brutal method of execution. You run your finger down the column and your heart stops. There it is. Your own name staring back at you, scheduled to be wiped from existence at sunrise. You are Marcia. You are his lover, his closest confidant, the one woman in this snake pit of a palace he supposedly trusts. And now you are looking at a ticking clock. You have maybe 60 minutes an hour at best before the most powerful tyrant on the planet steps out of that bath, dries his hands on a silk towel, and signs the order for your termination. Outside these walls, the city is vibrating with the energy of the New Year festival. All of Rome is counting down the seconds to a new beginning, oblivious to the darkness in the palace. But listen to me closely. If Commodus walks out of that room alive, you will never see the sun come up again. Not on January 1st, 193 AD. Not ever. You know exactly what happens to people who fall out of his favor. You have seen the iron hooks, the torture, the public spectacles of cruelty. You have witnessed the slow, deliberate humiliation he inflicts just to make an example of anyone who dares to question his divinity. But standing there with your heart hammering against your ribs like a war drum, a realization hits you. This isn't just about self-preservation anymore. This is bigger than you. For over a decade, this man has been a cancer hollowing out the greatest civilization on Earth from the inside out. He has drained the treasury into his own pockets, poisoned the military with incompetence, and turned the sacred arenas into slaughterhouses to satisfy his demonic bloodlust. So how does a woman with no armies, no official title, and zero political leverage end up standing in a dark corridor holding the fate of the entire known world in her hands? To understand that, we have to rewind the tape. We need to walk back through every twisted, corrupt chapter that brought the Roman Empire to its knees and put a monster in that bathtub. Erase the polished Hollywood narrative from your mind. Forget the brooding, misunderstood prince you saw in the movies. The real Commodus was something far more sinister. He wasn't just a tyrant, he was a predator in human skin. We are talking about a man who viewed human beings as disposable toys and genuinely believed he was a god walking among sheep ordained by the heavens to do whatever he pleased. Tonight, we are going to trace the entire arc of this nightmare, from a boy raised in unimaginable privilege to the beast soaking behind that wall through the fire, the sand, and the blood-soaked feasts, all leading to the split-second decision Marcia has to make. Before we go any deeper into this darkness, I need you to sound off in the comments. Let me know what city and country you are representing right now. And if you are new here, smash that subscribe button immediately. This is history unveiled, uncut, and uncensored, and we break down the dark chapters of the past like nobody else in the game. To truly grasp the horror of that steam-filled room, you have to go back more than 20 years to a freezing morning when a small child woke up wrapped in silk and was told the lie that the universe existed solely to serve him. Commodus wasn't some grit-toothed general's son from the borderlands. He was born right in the center of the web, inside the imperial palace, the son of Marcus Aurelius, the man history remembers as the philosopher king. From the moment he took his first breath, an army of servants materialized to cater to his every whim. Nurses, praetorian guards, tutors, dancers, slaves, hundreds of people whose entire existence was dedicated to keeping this one child comfortable, well-fed, and endlessly entertained. He was the center of a manufactured universe. No boy in the history of Rome had ever been so insulated from the harsh truths of reality. He wasn't the only child, though. Marcus Aurelius and his wife Faustina had to bury several sons and daughters before they reached maturity, a tragedy all too common even for the elite. Every tiny coffin chipped away at the emperor's soul, making the children who survived feel less like people and more like sacred artifacts. Commodus entered this world as a twin, but his brother didn't make it. That left him carrying a double burden on his small shoulders. He became the chosen one, the cherished heir, and a living, breathing reminder to his parents that fate could snatch everything away in a heartbeat. He was spoiled not just with material wealth, but with a desperate, suffocating protection. Marcus Aurelius poured the empire's resources into molding this boy. He brought in the top philosophers, the most battle-hardened veterans, the masters of rhetoric. A parade of experts marching through his chambers daily to fill his head with history, ethics, and the heavy responsibilities of command. On paper, the plan was flawless. It was the perfect blueprint for a leader. This child had every single advantage a future ruler could ever pray for. But there was a glitch in the programming. Something deep inside his spirit rejected the wisdom. His tutors saw the red flags early on. While other children would recoil at the sight of pain or suffering, Commodus leaned in closer. A wounded animal didn't elicit tears. It sparked a dark curiosity. He didn't want to fix it. He wanted to see how long it took to die. When a household slave made a mistake and broke a vase, he didn't throw a normal tantrum. He demanded blood. He demanded consequences that far outweighed the crime. The palace staff exchanged terrified looks, whispering that his temper was like a flash fire, but beneath the screaming was something far colder than simple anger. It was a malice that made even the scar-covered veterans uneasy. The turning point, the moment the whispers turned into genuine dread, happened when Commodus was roughly 11 years old. He had spent the entire day playing the role of the perfect prince, wearing the mask his father wanted him to wear. He had recited the speeches, studied the battle maps etched in wax, and sat through hours of lectures about virtue, duty, and stoicism. By the end of it, he was done. All he wanted was his bath. Now, for a Roman aristocrat, a bath isn't just washing up, it's a sacred ritual. The steam, the oils, the scraping, and most importantly, the water heated to a precise, luxurious temperature. Commodus walked into that chamber expecting absolute perfection. Instead, he dipped his foot in and found the water lukewarm. Maybe the furnace wasn't stoked enough. Maybe a slave lost track of time. It didn't matter. The water was tepid, and the boy didn't just complain like a normal child would. They dragged in the furnace attendant A. A man covered in soot, exhausted from feeding heavy logs into the fire since before dawn. In any other house in Rome, a kid's tantrum would get him sent to bed without supper. But this was the imperial palace. The words coming out of the heir's mouth carried the weight of absolute law. There was no higher authority in the room to check him. Commodus pointed a shaking finger at the trembling worker and issued a command that froze the blood of everyone present. He ordered the man to be thrown into the furnace and burned alive. Not whipped, not fired, incinerated. The adults in the room felt the atmosphere shift. This wasn't a child playing make-believe. This was a death sentence from the bloodline of Caesar. Nobody wanted to test the waters of refusing a direct order, so the attendants stalled. They bowed low, praising the young prince's strict sense of justice, and dragged the weeping furnace worker out of the room. Desperate to save an innocent man's life without triggering the boy's wrath, they came up with a plan. They led Commodus to the furnace chamber, blocked his view just enough to obscure the details, and threw bundles of raw wool soaked in animal fat into the roaring flames. The grease hit the fire and exploded, creating a thick, acrid, stomach-turning stench that smelled like burning flesh. Smoke billowed out. One of the attendants let out a blood-curdling scream to sell the performance. Commodus stood there, inhaling the smoke of what he thought was a burning human being, convinced he had just executed a man for tepid water. He didn't flinch. He didn't tremble. He didn't ask if the punishment was too harsh. He didn't show a flicker of remorse. He simply nodded, accepted that a lukewarm bath had been rectified by a human sacrifice, and walked back to his evening routine as if he had just swatted a fly. That total absence of humanity terrified the palace staff more than any screaming match ever could. Rome had survived angry emperors. It had survived paranoid ones, but it had never seen a child look at an execution with the boredom of someone watching paint dry. That dark secret might have stayed buried in the palace foundations. But in a place crawling with hundreds of servants, nothing stays quiet forever. Eventually, Commodus found out. Maybe a guard got drunk and talked. Maybe a slave confessed under the threat of the lash. However the truth came out, the boy learned that no one had actually been burned that day. And his reaction? It told you everything you needed to know about the darkness rotting his soul. He wasn't embarrassed by the deception. He didn't laugh it off as a lesson learned. He didn't feel a single ounce of relief that a human life had been spared. Instead, he went cold. He ordered the furnace worker to be tracked down and killed for real this time, and then he turned his vengeance on the men who had dared to trick him. Marcus Aurelius, who was fighting Germanic tribes on the frozen banks of the Danube, eventually heard the report. For a father who spent his nights writing meditations on mercy, self-discipline, and the sanctity of life, this was a devastating blow. He had worried that the soft life of the palace was making his son weak. Now, he was staring at a much uglier truth. It wasn't weakness, it was a void, a black hole where a human conscience was supposed to be. He still loved the boy, it was his flesh and blood. He still arrogantly believed he could fix him. But the story of the furnace spread through the court like a virus, and everyone who heard it came to the same chilling conclusion. The future emperor of Rome didn't just lack self-control. He lacked the basic capacity to feel empathy for another living soul. Marcus responded the only way a soldier knew how. He ripped Commodus out of his marble cocoon and dragged him to the frontier, straight into the military camps where the Roman legions were bleeding and freezing in the mud while fighting barbarian hordes. The plan was simple shock therapy. Show the boy real suffering. Let him smell the gangrene and see the amputations. Let him stand face to face with the soldiers who sacrificed their bodies for the eagle standard and force him to understand that ruling an empire meant carrying the crushing weight of millions of lives. Marcus wanted the brutality of war to crack open that hard shell and find the human being inside his son. But Commodus absorbed a completely different lesson from the trenches. He didn't learn humility. He discovered that even as a teenager, hardened killers dropped to their knees in the mud simply because he walked by. He realized that the same voice that had once commanded a single slave could now move entire legions of warriors. He didn't see duty, he saw absolute power. He lived for the adoration, the snap of 1,000 rigid salutes, and the thunderous rhythm of armored legions bowing at his feet. While the lectures on stoicism, sacrifice, and civic duty bounced harmlessly off his skull, the raw, intoxicating drug of absolute dominance went straight to his veins. He didn't care about strategy. He just loved screaming commands at battle-hardened veterans and watching them jump. For his father Marcus, the brutal frontier was a place of learning and endurance. For Commodus, it was just an appetizer for the unlimited control he craved. In the dead of night while the camp slept, Marcus would sit in solitary candlelight, penning the private thoughts that history would one day cherish as the meditations. He kept telling himself to hold the line, to be patient. He told himself to accept whatever hand fate dealt him. He tried desperately to love his son for who he actually was, rather than the man he prayed he would become. But the canyon between the emperor's hopes and the boy's reality was becoming impossible to bridge. Commodus couldn't care less about abstract virtues or philosophy. His mind was entirely consumed by wrestling matches, blood sports, and the thrill of the hunt. Whenever the emperor's wisest counselors attempted to steer him right, he would either tune out the noise or ridicule them the second they walked away. Yet Marcus refused to fold. He promoted Commodus to co-emperor when the kid was barely old enough to shave, gambling everything on the hope that the crushing weight of the crown would force him to grow up fast. He dragged him into the Senate, forcing him to listen to grey-bearded statesmen debate tax codes and border security. He planted him at high-stakes diplomatic dinners with foreign royalty. Every single move was a calculated lesson designed to scream one message: you are the future of this civilization. Learn how to carry the burden. But behind the polite nodding and the rehearsed smiles, Marcus could sense the boy's agitation boiling over. Commodus didn't want the job, he wanted the title. He wanted the glory without the grind. When Marcus Aurelius finally passed away in the spring of 180 AD, out in the wilds near the Danube, the empire didn't fall apart. It simply underwent a terrifying transfer of ownership. In the blink of an eye, a 19-year-old kid who had never heard the word no became the supreme ruler of a territory stretching from the misty highlands of Scotland to the burning sands of Egypt. The Senate prayed that the old guard would keep him on a leash. The citizens prayed that the philosopher's bloodline would ensure a wise reign. The military prayed for a leader who was both generous and tough. But nobody truly grasped the nature of the monster who had just wrapped his hands around the most powerful position on the planet. Initially, he made a move that looked deceptively like mercy. He immediately abandoned the grueling, bloody wars on the northern front and turned his chariot straight for Rome. To be fair, plenty of civilians were sick of the endless fighting, so peace sounded like a dream. But let's be clear, Commodus didn't end the war to save lives. He ended it because living on the frontier was too much work. He wanted heated marble floors beneath his sandals, not freezing mud. He wanted luxury spas and perfumes, not drafty canvas tents. He let his generals sign embarrassing treaties that his father would have shredded just so he could get back to the party faster. Once he was back inside the capital, Commodus walked into a system built to eat up every second of a leader's life. It was a mountain of paperwork petitions from desperate citizens, legal hearings reports from the provinces, treasury audits, and letters from governors pleading for orders. He took one look at that wall of responsibility and shoved almost all of it onto his inner circle. To catch, he decided to let the bureaucrats He decided to let the bureaucrats and middle managers handle the machinery of the state. He was there to enjoy the ride. If that had been the extent of it, history books might have just written him off as another lazy, spoiled rich kid. Disappointing, sure, but not exactly rare. Rome had survived slackers before. But what warped his reign into a genuine horror story wasn't just the laziness. It was how all that empty, unchecked time began to bloat his ego. He was surrounded 24/7 by sycophants who needed to kiss his ring to keep their fortunes and their heads attached to their bodies, so Commodus actually started believing the hype. They didn't just tell him he was the boss. They told him he was the chosen one, anointed, divinely favored in a way no Roman leader had ever been before. This is exactly where his obsession with becoming a living god started to fester. Sure, previous emperors got turned into gods after they died. It was a standard formality. A few even hinted at it while they were alive. But Commodus didn't want hints or metaphors. He demanded literal, straight-up worship. He became obsessed with the legend of Hercules, the mythical strongman who strangled lions and crushed monsters with nothing but brute force and a club. Commodus looked at that legend and saw his own reflection staring back. He saw himself as invincible, savage, existing completely outside human rules. He started stepping out in public, draped in a lion-skin chest, bare gripping a massive wooden club, like he had just walked off the set of a mythology movie. They even minted official currency showing not an emperor but Hercules Romanus, the Roman Hercules fusing the government with his own delusions of grandeur. He had sculptors carving statues that mashed up his face with the hero's muscular body. And here's the kicker: to question this cosplay was to challenge a god, and challenging a god was a capital offense. But eventually mere symbols weren't enough to feed his need. Commodus ordered a renovation of the colossal statue standing near the amphitheater, that towering bronze giant that used to be associated with Nero. He had the workers hack off the old head and replace it with his own face surrounded by sunbeams. Citizens who had walked past that monument their whole lives now had to look up every single morning and see Commodus staring down at them, his shadow stretching across the arena and the streets like a deity possessing the city. But he didn't stop at statues. He came for the calendar. He stripped the names of months that had existed since the founding of Rome and renamed them with his own titles, turning the very passage of time into a loop of his own identity. He even flirted with the idea of renaming the capital itself, branding the eternal city as Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. The legions, the grain supply fleets, the official archives, everything got stamped with some version of his name until every ship, every soldier, and every scroll screamed the same thing: I am the source of everything. Everything you see belongs to me. Inside the palace walls, this sickness infected every single conversation. The royal court turned into a competition of who could tell the biggest lie. Poets hailed him as the new sun rising over humanity. Priests worked his fake divinity into their sacred rituals. And anyone who paused, anyone whose smile faltered for a fraction of a second, was painting a target on their back. If you wanted to survive in Commodus's orbit, you had to master one survival skill: absolute agreement. You nodded. You affirmed. You swore he was Hercules in the flesh, and that no king in history came close to his power. Even if the words made you want to vomit, you said them with a smile, because the only other option was a death warrant with your name on it. But for Commodus, even this level of forced worship started to feel empty. Hearing people call him a god wasn't doing it anymore. He needed to feel the rush. He needed to perform that power in front of thousands of witnesses who were physically unable to look away. And in the city of Rome, there was only one stage massive enough for that kind of ego trip: the arena. Now, before we step onto that blood-soaked sand and uncover the horrors that happen next, I have a question for you. If this narrative has hooked you, if you can feel the tension rising as we watch this ruler spiral into total madness, then you might be exactly who we're looking for. We call our inner circle the lineage. This isn't just a subscription. It's a declaration that you are part of a community that refuses to let the ugly truth of history be sanitized or erased. Our members are the backbone of this entire operation. You get early access to episodes, behind-the-scenes intel we can't release to the general public, and you help us keep these investigations uncensored and uncompromising. If your gut is telling you that you belong here, check out the lineage and take your stand with us. Because for Commodus, the temples, the fancy titles, and the renamed months had stopped satisfying the beast inside him. He needed to physically demonstrate that he was a god. He needed a venue where the screaming of tens of thousands of people would drown out any lingering whisper of doubt in his own head. And he found exactly what he was looking for in the heart of Rome, inside that massive stone beast the world would come to know as the Colosseum. He was convinced that the moment he stepped onto that sand, he wouldn't just be ruling. He would be proving to every set of eyes in the empire that he was something far beyond human. What he decided to do inside those walls would drag Rome into a living nightmare that made his father's worst fears look like a gentle warning. He had already rewritten reality to cast himself as a deity. Now he was about to force an entire civilization to live inside his twisted fantasy, whether they wanted to or not. And the price of admission for that fantasy was going to be gallons of human blood. When being worshipped on paper and in stone stopped working, Commodus went looking for the one place where no one could close their eyes: the amphitheater. The structure the world now calls the Colosseum had been used by emperors for generations as a tool for crowd control. Free food, exotic beasts, choreographed violence. It was all designed to keep the population loyal and distracted. But every emperor before him had presided over the games from a safe distance, watching from the imperial box like a CEO checking on his investment. Commodus had zero interest in watching. He intended to be the main event. At first, the rumors hitting the streets were too crazy to believe. Word started leaking out that the Emperor of Rome had been fighting as a gladiator in secret training in private gyms where no regular citizen could see the embarrassment. You have to understand, gladiators were considered the lowest of the low in Roman society, basically social outcasts. In the ancient world, the arena was the pit for the lowest of the low-chained souls, condemned men and those broken spirits who traded their birthright for a single meal. For the ruler of the known world to descend into that filth and pick up a weapon wasn't just a mistake, it was a spiritual violation. It spat in the face of every foundation the empire stood upon. The high-ranking senators, the gatekeepers of the day, whispered in the shadows that this was the ultimate degradation of the throne. But Commodus, he was operating under a different spirit. He didn't care about their traditions or their outrage. He was addicted to the visceral power of the blade in his fist and the roar of the masses, that demonic fantasy of adoration. The mask came all the way off. He stopped operating in the shadows and stepped into the light with a dark announcement. He declared that he wouldn't just sit on the throne and watch, he was entering the ring. He announced he would fight publicly, not as the dignified ruler over the games, but as a competitor stepping right onto the blood-soaked sand. The decree rippled through the city like a shockwave. The common people couldn't even process the reality of what was unfolding before their eyes. But when the appointed time came, there he was manifested in the flesh. Commodus stood there, draped in the skin of a lion, cosplaying as Hercules, planting his feet on ground, stained with death. Tens of thousands of Romans froze holding their breath, witnessing a king degrade himself into a beast. The political class sat paralyzed in the front row faces, pale as ghosts, fully aware that one wrong move meant their heads would roll. But let's be clear, this wasn't spiritual warfare. This was a charade. It was completely rigged. Commodus never put his life on the line. Every single enemy he faced was handpicked and broken before they even stepped into the arena. We are talking about opponents who were chained down, barely able to lift their arms. Some were handed wooden training sticks, useless toys against imperial steel. Others were drugged out of their minds, stumbling into the pit, half asleep and semi-conscious, easy prey for a predator pretending to be a warrior. When he hunted beasts, he did it from high towers or behind reinforced barricades, raining down arrows from a safety zone where no claw could ever touch him. There was absolutely no risk involved. It was pure theater, a demonic illusion of strength. The official propaganda machine later claimed he fought hundreds of times, with some ancient records pushing that number past 700 victories. Each appearance was hype-manicured into a monumental spectacle, and he paid himself like a superstar athlete. The imperial treasury was looted to the tune of roughly 1 million sesterces for every single performance, funneling public wealth directly into his private bank accounts. That wealth was stripped from the people through crushing taxes squeezed from provinces that were already snapping under the pressure, and stolen from everyday folks who would never see a dime of it back. The empire was bleeding out financially, just so one man could play hero in a costume. Yet from his vantage point, the worship looked real. The stadium exploded with noise every time he lifted that weapon. The mob chanted every blasphemous title he bestowed upon himself. They begged for mercy for his beaten victims, just so he could wave his hand and grant it, posing like a benevolent god. But anyone who really studies the history, anyone with eyes to see, knows exactly why that applause never died down. The stands were infested with spy soldiers and informants planted by the regime. Every person in that crowd knew the score. One slip of the mask could be a death sentence. A visible flinch, a look of disgust, or even turning away at the wrong moment, it was all being watched, recorded, and punished. So, the people clapped until their hands bled and their fake smiles hurt. The senators took the brunt of the shame. Commodus forced them into the front row so close to the slaughter that warm blood splattered onto their expensive robes, close enough to count every fraudulent strike. These were men who had commanded legions, governed massive territories, and negotiated peace treaties between nations. Now they were prisoners in high places, forced to watch their leader play dress-up with live steel and rigged victims. They couldn't walk out. They couldn't speak up. They just had to sit under their ceremonial wreaths and sweat it out. Survival became a dark art. Roman historians record that these high-ranking officials started chewing on laurel leaves during the shows, grinding them between their teeth just to keep their jaw muscles moving constantly. If horror or disgust twisted their faces, the chewing provided a cover story. It was the leaves, not the revulsion, causing the grimace. Others went the opposite route, throwing themselves into manic, exaggerated applause, clapping like madmen to hide their clenched jaws and terror-filled throats. Every twitch in those front rows was a calculated move to stay alive. How do you look entertained when your gut is twisting inside out? One specific nightmare burned itself into the collective memory of every senator present. Commodus had an ostrich dragged out, and with one dramatic swing, he chopped its head clean off. He didn't speak a word. He didn't have to. He didn't speak a word. He didn't have to. He lifted that twitching head and slowly swept his free hand across the row of powerful men, drawing a line in the air from the bird's severed neck to theirs. The message didn't need a translator. Your head comes off just as easily as this bird's. In that heavy silence, one senator finally cracked. A nervous, desperate laughter bubbled up, the kind of sound that escapes when pure horror overrides the brain's ability to cope. He tried to stifle it behind his hand, but eyes were watching. That senator didn't make it to the next calendar year. Commodus was looking for any excuse to liquidate anyone whose loyalty wavered, and his hit list grew longer with every single performance he gave. His appetite for darkness didn't stop at rigged matches and animal massacres. The arena became his personal laboratory for inventing new nightmares and humiliation. Exotic beasts were shipped in from the edges of the known world, brought to Babylon to die. Lions, leopards, hippos, elephants, all paraded out and slaughtered for the spectacle. Sometimes he used custom-engineered arrows or weighted javelins to show off his precision. The crowd marveled at the aim, but the spiritual atmosphere was poisonous. This wasn't hunting for food or tradition. These were ritualistic killings staged for one man's entertainment. But the darkest chapter opened when he turned his gaze toward the people the system had already thrown away. The city's most vulnerable, the poor, the disabled, those with spinal deformities begging for scraps outside the temples were nothing to him. Commodus didn't see human souls deserving of compassion. He saw raw material. He ordered these people snatched off the streets and dragged into the pit of the amphitheater. To complete this sick production, his handlers tied crude tails to their bodies, using rope and fabric to make them look like serpents. These terrified souls were shoved onto the sand in front of a crowd that went dead silent. Then Commodus stepped out, costume on club raised high. He announced to the stadium that he was about to purge monsters from the earth. There was no contest, there was no resistance. He clubbed them down one by one, shattering skulls and breaking bodies while thousands watched the massacre. The crowd knew exactly what they were looking at. These were neighbors, not mythical beasts. But they cheered anyway. They cheered because if they didn't, they would be next. When the dust settled, the floor was slick with the blood of people whose only crime was existing in a body that a tyrant found useful for a skit. They hauled the remains away like garbage. The official records praised the emperor's heroic victory over unnatural creatures. No one in any position of authority dared to speak the obvious truth. The leader of the civilized world beat defenseless citizens to death in broad daylight and called it high art. By then, the Senate was a hollow shell. The people were paralyzed by trauma. The image of Commodus as Hercules wasn't just propaganda, it was a threat stamped in bronze and circulated on every coin in your pocket. He operated as a law unto himself, a false deity deciding who lived and who died based on nothing but a mood swing. But the arena, as demonic as it was only half the nightmare. What he performed in front of screaming thousands was grotesque. What went down behind the sealed doors of the imperial palace was infinitely worse. Inside those walls, day and night blurred into an endless cycle of gluttony, drunkenness, and casual violence. Commodus hoarded an enormous harem. Ancient writers describe hundreds of victims, men and women harvested from all over the empire. Some were bought at the slave markets. Others were children snatched from noble families who couldn't say no to the emperor's agents. Once those palace gates slammed shut, they lost it all. Their freedom, their dignity, even their names. Commodus arranged them like toy soldiers, forcing them into twisted role plays or humiliating costumes. They weren't partners, they were living furniture. The inner circle who attended these parties witnessed things that were too vile to ever make it into the history books. Tables groaned under mountains of food, while music played in the torchlight. Commodus drank like there was no tomorrow, but the wine didn't soften him. It only sharpened his cruelty, letting the dark impulses take full control. He would force his victims to perform unspeakable acts in front of the crowd, scanning the room for any sign of judgment. If you flinched, he filed it away. You were next. He loved flipping the script on the powerful. Men who held the keys to the empire could be reduced to court jesters with a snap of his fingers. One famous incident involved his own Praetorian prefect, the man in charge of the military and the emperor's own safety. In front of a packed room, Commodus ordered this top general to strip naked and dance around, banging little cymbals, shaking and swaying while the whole room stared. He couldn't say no. Refusal was a death sentence. So he danced, face burning with shame, while the emperor leaned back and laughed at the destruction of a man's soul. You have to understand, these events weren't just some twisted form of entertainment for the masses. They were a systematic dismantling of the human spirit, a total spiritual demolition. When you have a scenario where the commander of the emperor's own elite guard gets turned into a laughingstock on command, it sends a chilling message that rank status and earthly achievements offer absolutely zero protection against the beast system. It didn't matter what title you held or what service you had rendered to the state. None of that carnal prestige could shield you from the dark, impulsive nature of the emperor. One misunderstood look, a singe second of hesitation, and you could slide from being the guest of honor to a broken victim between the appetizer and the main course, with the night usually ending in a blood sacrifice because Commodus loved to weaponize fear, and sometimes the grand finale of these evening banquets wasn't a toast but a sudden brutal execution right there in the dining hall. Maybe a slave spilled a drop of wine, or a messenger brought news that didn't fit the narrative, or a servant moved just a fraction too slow. Any of them could be beaten, tortured, or taken out right on the floor, while the other guests sat there paralyzed, staring at their plates, praying to whatever god they knew that they wouldn't be the next target. Then you have to look at his private demonic fascination with the actual mechanics of death, because it wasn't enough for him to just order a hit from a distance or stage it in the public arena for the crowds. He developed this deeply personal, almost ritualistic obsession with opening up the human body, watching the life force leave the flesh in real time. Ancient sources tell us he would role-play as a physician in a grotesque parody of medicine, summoning a servant under the guise of examining a minor issue, only to pick up actual surgical instruments with malicious intent. Let's be clear, there was never any intention to heal or restore. He was making incisions to see what lay beneath the veil of the skin. He would slice open veins just to observe the hydraulics of the blood pressing on fresh wounds to study the victim's reaction. Watching the stages of shock and agony with the cold, detached focus of a scientist studying a lab rat. Sometimes he would deliberately prolong the process, slowing the bleeding to extend his sick observation, and other times he'd get bored and finish it quickly. The outcome was always the same, always a tragedy, another corpse, another dark experiment concluded in the halls of power. This added another heavy layer of dread settling over every single person living within those marble walls. For anyone existing in his orbit, the world stopped making logical sense. The emperor, who called himself Hercules, the supposed protector of civilization, was actually the man who might slice you open with a scalpel after dessert just because he wanted to watch the light go out in your eyes. There was no safe role to play in this drama, whether you were a concubine, a guard, a cook, or a high-ranking senator called in for a meeting. If his mood was generous, maybe you walked out with a gift, but if his mood was dark, you were carried out through the back door in a body bag. Now at this point, we need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Everything we are discussing here comes from ancient biographies, speeches, and historical accounts that the mainstream usually ignores. For this deep dive, we relied heavily on one modern work in particular, an exhaustive investigation into Commodus and the spirit of his era. That book, which serves as the foundation beneath this entire script, is available to you right now. If you look at your screen and tap the View Products button, you're going to find it front and center. This isn't just light reading for the weekend. It is a relentless archive of imperial madness, a monumental piece of scholarship that goes way deeper than any single video ever could. If you truly want to understand how a civilization collapses under the weight of one man's delusion, something very relevant. As we move through 2026, that book belongs in your library. And while you're there, don't just stop at the main volume. We have put together a curated collection of objects and relics tied to stories exactly like this one. Immersive pieces of history that you can actually hold in your own hands. The selection rotates, so I won't spoil what's in stock right now, but if you browse the full collection, you'll find items designed to pull you even deeper into the reality of these ancient worlds. You are also going to find our hand-picked list of essential dark history books chosen specifically to transform your personal library into a serious archive of humanity's most disturbing chapters. Go ahead and open the shop, explore while you listen, and start building a collection that is worthy of the heavy stories you are absorbing. Back in Rome, the horrors inside the palace didn't stay contained. Secrets bled through the walls, carried by surviving slaves, whispering to one another, and shaken courtiers confiding in the few people they hoped they could still trust. The city heard the fragments, forced performances, mutilated bodies, screams reverberating through the marble corridors deep into the night. When you combine that with what every citizen had already witnessed in the amphitheater, the conclusion was inescapable. This emperor wasn't just corrupt or incompetent. He was unraveling, he was dangerous, and he was completely beyond prediction. His paranoia swelled in lockstep with his brutality, and every person he degraded, every life he took, added another face to the gallery of potential avengers haunting his waking nightmares. He cycled through officials at a dizzying speed, elevating favorites into positions of enormous power, and then destroying them the moment a spark of suspicion flickered. City prefects, praetorian commanders, palace administrators, they rose and crashed in rapid succession like waves against a jagged cliff. Every downfall came with wild accusations, sham trials, and frequently immediate executions. Blood ran through the corridors of government just as freely as it did through the servant quarters, and the Senate had abandoned any pretense of actually governing. It existed solely to applaud the madness or be punished for silence. Ordinary Romans stopped expecting fairness, justice, or stability. They learned to navigate life under a ruler whose temperament could reshape their entire reality between sunrise and sunset. Some tried to disappear into the shadows of anonymity, while others tried to profit by reinforcing his delusional fantasies. But beneath every strategy sat the same suffocating certainty. There was no floor, no bottom to this pit. There was no boundary this emperor would not cross. He had converted the amphitheater into his personal stage and transformed the palace into a labyrinth of suffering. He had gutted the Senate's authority and conditioned the Roman people to clap their hands while innocents were murdered right in front of them. And yet something inside him still churned. The terror he generated didn't bring him peace. It wound him tighter, making every hushed conversation sound like a conspiracy. Every unfamiliar face triggered that deep-seated suspicion, and when strangers and slaves no longer satisfied the need to crush potential threats, his focus began to shift. There was one group, one inner circle that he had not yet fully turned against. This was the circle of people who shared his blood, who carried his earliest memories, and who knew his secrets better than anyone alive. As the paranoia deepened, he stopped seeing them as family and started seeing them as the most dangerous enemies of all. When Commodus finally aimed that suspicion at his own relatives, the violence entered its final, most intimate and most destructive phase. The man who had shattered the Senate and numbed an entire population was about to direct his fury at the only people who had ever been close enough to remember the child he once was. Once he began cutting through his own bloodline, the clock counting down to that last night in the bathhouse started ticking for real. When Commodus finally turned his suspicion toward his own family, it didn't arrive like a sudden thunderclap. It crept in slowly like rising water in a flood. After years of grinding strangers into dust, after slaughtering the helpless for sport and humiliating the most powerful men in Rome, for entertainment, looking across a dinner table at your own blood and seeing an enemy instead of a relative becomes disturbingly easy. The first person to feel that atmospheric shift was his elder sister Lucilla. Lucilla had once occupied one of the most enviable positions in the entire Roman world, daughter of Marcus Aurelius, widow of a former emperor. At one point in her life, she had technically outranked Commodus himself. But when their father died, and her younger brother claimed the throne, she watched the boy she had grown up beside transform into something she barely recognized. She saw the child who once demanded a man be burned alive become the emperor who butchered civilians in costume. She heard the whispers from terrified senators and trembling servants, and she arrived at the same conclusion that others were reaching in silence. If nobody intervened, this man would devour the empire from the inside out. So, sometime around AD 182, Lucilla threw her weight behind a conspiracy. It wasn't an elegant operation by any means. It was frantic, clumsy, and born completely out of desperation. A handful of senators and military officers agreed to strike at Commodus in public, but the design was incredibly crude. The plan was that as the emperor entered a theater, a young man would step forward with a blade, shout something about the Senate delivering justice, and kill him before the bodyguards could close the gap. Lucilla and her co-conspirators would then seize control of the Praetorian Guard and steady the empire under new leadership. But the assassin choked. He approached Commodus, drew his weapon, delivered his rehearsed line, and then froze. That single heartbeat of hesitation was all it took for the guards to swarm him, wrestle the blade away, and drag him into custody. Under interrogation, he broke immediately and the names poured out. He named fellow conspirators, sympathetic senators, and finally Lucilla. The emperor's own sister had reached for a knife, however indirectly against a man who believed he was a god walking the earth. Something fractured inside Commodus that day. He had always been vicious, but now he felt hunted. If the woman who shared his father's blood wanted him dead, then loyalty was nothing but a fiction. Lucilla wasn't executed immediately. First came exile, banished to an island severed from every connection that had once made her formidable. But exile under a ruler, this paranoid is really just death with a waiting period. Eventually the order came down. She was killed far from Rome, stripped of influence. Her name turned to ash at court. Commodus had his vengeance, but security didn't follow. The opposite happened. The circle of people he was willing to trust contracted to almost nothing. Listen closely, because once the enemy established a stronghold, with Lucilla, the floodgates of persecution burst wide open. It wasn't just a political purge, it was a spiritual assignment against the bloodline. Every single woman who carried that imperial DNA found herself standing in the crosshairs of a demonic paranoia. We are talking about sisters, cousins, high-ranking ladies. It didn't matter. If you had a drop of relation to the throne, you were marked. The history books try to hide the grit, but the ancient texts give us a glimpse into the darkness, showing us how they slapped these women with the oldest trick in the book: accusations of deep moral filth and corruption. You hear whispers of dark rituals of forced humiliation that would make your stomach turn. And then, absolute silence. The grave. Now the mainstream historians and the propaganda machine of that day tried to scrub the details, but you can feel the screams echoing through the corridors of time. This man took the women of his own house, his own flesh and blood, dragged them through the mud of public scandal, terrorized them, and when they served the beast system's purpose, he disposed of them like trash. Imagine the family dinners in that imperial residence. It wasn't a home, it was a snake pit. The atmosphere was so thick with the spirit of fear, you could cut it with a knife. Every soul sitting at that table knew the truth. Sharing the emperor's bloodline wasn't an insurance policy. It was a death sentence. It put a massive target right on your back. And folks, even his own wife Brutia Crispina was not spared from this descending madness. She was just a pawn in the game, married off to Commodus for political clout. She was a respectable woman doing her duty to raise up heirs and smile for the cameras at state events. But instead of a royal life, she got a front-row ticket to a horror show. She watched this man descend into absolute arena insanity and private wickedness. And sure enough, the spirit of destruction eventually turned its gaze right onto her. They hit her with the classic setup adultery. That is the go-to move for every tyrant when they want to delete a wife without answering questions. They shipped her off to the island of Capri. Sound familiar? And there she was taken out. Executed. There was no due process, no jury of her peers, no chance to speak her truth. Just another innocent life snuffed out by a corrupt judicial system. She was erased simply to silence the chaotic voices in his tormented mind. And as the wives and sisters vanished into the night, Commodus replaced them with a harem of concubines. But here is where it gets twisted, folks. He actually took one of these women and renamed her Faustina after his own deceased mother. That is a level of perversion that speaks volumes about the spirit operating in him. That one detail tells you more about the demonic strongholds in his mind than any textbook ever could. He was tearing down the boundaries set by nature and God. Mother lover property. It was all a blur of confusion. He was rebuilding the very concept of family into a warped idol he could control 100%. He wanted zero independent thought, just total submission, erasing any memory of a time when righteous men actually led the nation. But the spirit of death didn't stay inside the palace walls. It spread outward like a plague. Look at the Quintili brothers. These were top-tier men, wealthy, accomplished, loved by the people. And because they had light, the darkness hated them. Commodus looked at their sterling reputation and didn't see allies. He saw a threat to his fragile ego and his grip on power. So what did he do? He framed them. Conspiracy, sorcery, whatever stuck to the wall to justify the takedown. They were liquidated folks. The state seized their assets, stole their land, and wiped them out. It was a message to the masses. If the two most respected citizens in the empire could be crushed like bugs, nobody was safe from the long arm of the tyrant. Paranoia started feeding on superstition, which is always the playground of the enemy. Commodus started seeing ghosts in the shadows, reading doom in coincidences. It got so bad that men were executed just because they looked like someone he didn't like. Imagine that, losing your life because your physical face triggered a demon in a ruler's soul. People were being taken out for owning the wrong books or consulting the stars, as if seeking knowledge was an act of war against his destiny. But every fresh kill solved absolutely nothing. All it did was pour gasoline on the fire, convincing him that his enemies were multiplying faster than he could pull the trigger. It is a cycle of destruction that never ends until the system collapses. We are 12 years deep into this nightmare, and the trail of bodies stretched from the nameless slaves in the gutter to the highest seats of power. Former consuls, family members, nobody was spared. And while the blood flowed, the actual machinery of the government was rotting from the inside out. Commodus stopped caring about ruling the people and focused entirely on his own delusions. He handed the keys to the kingdom over to his handlers men, like the chamberlain Cleander, who turned the government into a criminal enterprise. They were auctioning off powerful positions to the highest bidder, literal pay-to-play corruption. This breeds instability, folks. Eventually the food ran out, the abuse became too much, and the people took to the streets in violent riots. The mob woke up and demanded justice. And what does a coward do? He throws his own man under the bus. Commodus sacrificed Cleander to the crowd, let them parade his severed head through the city, and then washed his hands of the whole mess. He acted like he had nothing to do with the chaos he created. Typical tyrant behavior: never take responsibility, just shift the blame. With every crisis, he retreated further into his own matrix. He started believing he was Hercules incarnate, a living god, the very center of the universe. He actually renamed the months of the year after himself. He even floated the idea of renaming the eternal city of Rome. This is the ultimate form of narcissism and rebellion against reality. He slapped his brand on the military legions, the grain fleets, the institutions of the state. As the real world fell apart, he desperately stamped his name on anything he could touch. In his twisted mind, the answer to every problem was simple: more of him, more control, more worship. It is the spirit of the Antichrist seeking to be all in all. By the final weeks of AD 192, his dark fantasies took a terrifying leap. He wasn't satisfied with just playing God in the arena anymore. For January 1st, AD 193, he planned to kick off the new year, not in the robes of a statesman, but dressed as a gladiator. He was going to mock the dignity of the office. He intended to merge the highest civilian office with his bloodsport persona. His vision: to rule Rome openly from the fighting pit, a warrior god conquering foes while the masses cheered for their own enslavement. But underneath the spectacle, there were darker, more sinister rumors swirling in the shadows. Intelligence sources from the time claim he planned a massive purge, executing the top senators on day one to wipe out the last pockets of resistance in a single morning of carnage. Whether every detail of that plan was fully operational matters less than the fact that the people believed it. The fear was real. Look, they had seen the pattern. They watched Lucilla get taken out. They saw Crispina disappear into the void. They had that severed ostrich head thrown at them as a threat. When the word got out that Commodus was starting the year as a blood-soaked killer, many of them made their peace with God, assuming the end was here. And that brings us right back to that steam-filled bathhouse on the final night of AD 192. In a back room, 3 individuals were staring at a wax tablet that had just changed the trajectory of history. They were looking at their own death warrants. You had Marcia the concubine, who shared his bed and poured his cup. You had Latus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard, the muscle, and Eclectus, the man who ran the palace. These were the insiders, the people closest to the beast. Written on that tablet in careful script was a hit list for the next morning. And guess whose names were at the top? All 3 of them. This wasn't a warning shot. It wasn't a negotiation. Commodus wasn't planning to have a chat. He was planning to liquidate them. The order was signed and sealed. It didn't matter if it was public or private. They had become inconvenient to the narrative, and in his world you get deleted for that. They looked at each other and the reality hit them like a freight train. There was no talking their way out of this, no apology would work. You cannot call in a favor with a demon. A man who slaughtered his own sister isn't going to spare a girlfriend and two bureaucrats out of sentiment. The countdown clock was ticking. Marcia realized she was the one with the direct access code. She knew his routine better than anyone alive. She knew that after the bath he liked to drink, relax, and fade out. She knew where his spiritual armor was weak. She realized, he trusts me. It would never cross his arrogant mind that the threat was sleeping right next to him. Latus had the soldiers sure. Eclectus had the keys to the doors. But getting physically close to the target when his guard was down, that was Marcia's heavy cross to carry. They made the call in minutes. There was no time to organize a resistance or build a coalition. It was do or die. Telling one more person creates a risk of a leak. It had to be just the three of them, a pitcher of wine, and whatever move the spirit led them to make. Because if they missed, if Commodus woke up on January 1st, they were all dead men walking. Marcia stepped up to the plate. She called for the servants she trusted, ordered the wine, and according to the ancient records, she loaded it with a heavy dose of poison. She didn't sprinkle a little bit. She poured enough to drop a giant. She needed to take down a man who believed his physical body was immortal. As she mixed that cup, the memories must have flooded her mind. The screams from the furnace, the mangled bodies dragged out of the Colosseum, the women who walked in and never walked out, the servants he tortured while playing surgeon. That trauma became her fuel. That righteous anger kept her hands from shaking. Commodus was soaking in the bath, totally clueless, surrounded by steam. He was probably already visualizing the crowd roaring the next morning, imagining himself stepping out as the gladiator king mocking the very throne he sat on. He was likely grinning, thinking about the terror on the senators' faces. He had zero clue that on the other side of the wall, the one person he viewed as a harmless pet was turning his nightly routine into a delivery system for his death. When he stepped out, wrapped in his linens, Marcia was there, cool as a cucumber. Her body language said business as usual. Just another night, another cup of wine. She poured that drink without a single flinch. If he had seen even a flicker of fear in her eyes, it would have been over. But his pride blinded him. This is the man who thought he could smell a plot a mile away, yet he couldn't sense the angel of death standing 2 feet in front of him. He took the cup and drank. For a moment, the world stood still. Servants kept working, guards stood watch. Marcia stepped back, maybe praying, maybe trembling. The minutes dragged on like hours. For a suffocating second there, it looked like the poison wasn't going to work. Then the judgment hit. The nausea slammed into him. He started vomiting violently, his body rejecting the toxin. You have to remember, this guy was strong, conditioned by years of combat training and excess. His system fought for survival with everything it had clawing back against the darkness. This was the absolute nightmare scenario that kept them awake at night, the moment where the rubber meets the road. If the poison failed, if he managed to shake off the toxins and realize the betrayal that was unfolding, the retaliation would be apocalyptic. He wouldn't just stop at executing the three of them. He would burn the entire city to the ground in a fit of demonic rage. He would tear Rome apart, brick by brick, hunting down every single soul who had ever even exchanged a casual glance with Marcia or whispered a secret to Latus. The clock had run out, and waiting around was simply signing their own death warrants. They had no choice but to activate the nuclear option, the contingency plan designed for total finality. This was a strategy that left absolutely zero margin for error and no room for second guessing. They sent for Narcissus. This wasn't just some random hired muscle. This was a professional wrestler, a lethal weapon in human form. This was a man who had trained side by side with Commodus, a man who had thrown the emperor to the mat in practice sessions and understood the tyrant's physical capabilities and weaknesses better than any living soul on the planet. The conspirators laid it all out on the table for him, explaining exactly what needed to go down. Whether they threatened his life, offered him a massive bribe, or simply described the horrific fate Commodus had planned for the morning and let the wrestler connect the dots himself, the historical records remain silent. The sources do not give us the why, they only record the what. And what happened next was a direct intervention into the course of history. The palace, typically a massive machine, engineered for constant noise bustle and bureaucratic movement, fell into an unnerving, supernatural silence around the emperor's private quarters. It was the calm before the storm. The vast majority of the household staff and guards had absolutely no clue that the entire timeline of the Roman Empire was shifting right above their heads. A small handful of trusted servants stood guard, redirecting anyone who approached with carefully crafted lies about the emperor feeling unwell and needing absolute rest. But inside that chamber, the reality was far grimmer. Commodus lay there, completely depleted from the poison and the violent vomiting, his body betraying him. His muscles were unreliable, his god complex was shattering, and his awareness was fractured. He was finally alone with the one variable he had spent his entire reign underestimating: the wrath of the people he abused. He was facing a human being who was close enough to touch him and determined enough to finish the job once and for all. Narcissus stepped into the room, and you need to picture the intensity of these final moments in that cramped, humid space. There was no Colosseum glory here, no roaring crowds chanting his name, no elevated platform keeping the emperor safely perched above the danger of the common man. There were no opponents hobbled by chains or armed with useless wooden blades to stroke his ego. It was just wet marble, bare skin, and two powerful arms locking around the throat of a man who had spent years telling the world he was a god. Commodus would have fought back with everything he had left. He was clawing, thrashing, and desperately trying to wrench free from the judgment that had finally caught up to him. But the poison had stolen his supernatural strength. The element of surprise had stolen his preparation, and the wrestler's trained grip did not falter for a second. In the end, the emperor, who had the arrogance to rename months and cities and legions after himself, could not summon enough air to scream for help. The pressure held tight, the struggle weakened, the beast was being put down, and the so-called god died the exact same way every mortal does, gasping for breath in the dirt. For one suspended, terrifying moment, the massive Roman Empire had no ruler. A body cooled on the floor of a private room, while three conspirators and one wrestler stood over it, breathing hard, hearts hammering against their ribs, each of them trying to process the sheer enormity of what they had just done. They had just killed the most powerful man on earth. They had to move fast, or they would be next. The corpse was immediately taken away, and prepared in a manner that would support a cover story of sudden natural illness. They raced against the clock to secure the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, to assemble support in the Senate, and to install a successor before the rival factions could mobilize and plunge the city into civil war. They settled on Pertinax. He was a veteran senator, a former military commander, a law and order man the establishment respected. In the frantic high-stakes hours between midnight and dawn, they maneuvered him into power. The Senate, absolutely stunned but desperate to close the dark chapter on Commodus, ratified the choice without asking too many questions. The reaction was immediate. Statues of the dead emperor were hauled down and smashed in the streets. His accumulated titles were stripped away instantly. An official damnatio memoriae was proclaimed, a formal legal condemnation of his memory. His name was to be chiseled off every inscription and monument. The months and cities he had renamed were ordered to revert to their original titles immediately. Rome tried desperately to scrub 12 years of madness off its walls like it was washing away dried blood. But here is the hard truth. You cannot simply undo a decade of institutional trauma and spiritual rot with a Senate vote and a mason's chisel. The damage had burrowed too deep into the soul of the nation. The army was fractured, the Senate was hollowed out, and the people had been conditioned to live in fear rather than trust. The exact same Praetorian Guard that had ushered Pertinax onto the throne turned on him within a few short months, murdered him in cold blood, and then did something unprecedented, even by corrupt Roman standards. They auctioned off the empire to the highest bidder. A wealthy senator named Didius Julianus purchased the throne like he was buying a piece of property at a public estate sale. The empire spiraled out of control into the violent upheaval historians call the Year of the Five Emperors, as generals across the provinces fought each other for control like warlords. Commodus was dead, but the systemic rot he had cultivated was now consuming the entire structure from within. The beast system was eating itself alive. And what about Marcia, the woman who had read her own name on a death list and chosen to act instead of wait. She did not emerge as a celebrated liberator or a hero of the people. Under the reign of Didius Julianus, both she and Eclectus were executed. They had removed a monster from the throne, but they had not escaped the merciless arithmetic of Roman power politics. It is a tragic reality that the people who help create emperors are almost always consumed when the next wave of ambition crashes through. The woman who freed Rome from 12 years of direct tyranny was swallowed by the same violent current that had drowned countless others before her. In the years that followed, Commodus proved impossible to keep buried. Later emperors, particularly Septimius Severus, selectively rehabilitated his image when it served their own political interests. Statues were dismantled and then quietly reconstructed when the narrative needed to change. It was political theatre at its finest. Thankfully, historians like Cassius Dio and Herodian set down their accounts, preserving both his atrocities and their revulsion for generations to come. The Damnatio Memoriae failed in the one way that matters most to anyone living in 2026. We still know exactly who he was. So what are we supposed to do with a dark story like this today? We are looking at a boy cradled in silk who grew up to order a man burned alive just because the bathwater was lukewarm. A teenager who absorbs none of his father's wisdom or philosophy and treats every human life around him as an expendable resource for his own amusement. We see a ruler who converts the greatest arena in the ancient world into a stage for his rigged delusions, who clubs defenseless people to death while wearing the skin of a mythological hero, and who slices open his own servants with surgical tools just for the sick pleasure of watching them die. This is the spirit of the Antichrist manifested in government. A man who destroys his sister, discards his wife, erases his relatives, and ultimately forces the people closest to him to choose between waiting for their own execution or committing murder to survive. The takeaway here is not that Commodus was some kind of supernatural evil entity. The terrifying takeaway is that he was a human being handed absolute unchecked power inside a system with no guardrails. One man's psychological disintegration became government policy, public entertainment, and enforceable law. The palace attendants who faked an execution using wool and animal fat when he was 11 years old were trying to save one life, trying to manage a monster in the making. But what they accidentally revealed was a truth the empire would pay for again and again. This child experienced absolutely no empathy when another person suffered. And when that child grew up to command armies, treasuries, and courts, the entire Roman world became his personal furnace room. Absolute power did not transform Commodus into a god. It exposed exactly how hollow and empty he had always been. The man who paraded as Hercules before terrorized crowds died on the floor of his own palace, killed not by a foreign invasion, not by a rival claimant, but by 3 exhausted people who had simply run out of time to keep surviving him. The emperor who renamed the months and the eternal city after himself could not even control his own final breath. If you made it through this entire story, thank you for sticking with us. These are not comfortable events to sit with, but they are necessary to understand the nature of power. These events are brutal, ugly, and disturbingly real. If you want more history, delivered at this depth and with this kind of raw honesty, you need to subscribe right now and hit that like button so you do not miss what comes next. Send this video to someone who still thinks the Hollywood movie told the whole story, and let them discover how much darker the truth really was. This is the premier destination for uncovering the hidden past, and we will be right here waiting to walk you through the next chapter of history's darkest secrets. Stay vigilant.